So, how exactly does a plan for some train tracks in a quiet corner of Utah blow up into a landmark case at the U.S. Supreme Court? It's a really fascinating story about oil, the environment, and a 50-year-old law that just got a major rethink from the highest court in the land. Let's dig in and piece it all together. Okay, so our story kicks off right here with this, an 88-mile railroad planned for rural Utah. And look, we're not talking about some massive coast-to-coast high-speed network. This is a short, really specialized line, and it's designed to do one specific thing: unlock the resources of a very isolated region. But this one little project somehow ignited a legal firestorm that went all the way to the top. So the big question is, how? How did this one railway become the test case that could literally change the rules for building almost everything in America, from highways and bridges to the wind farms of the future? To really get a handle on the impact, we've got to get inside the court's head. So let's break down the project, the legal fight, and what this ruling really means for what's next. First things first, let's take a closer look at the project that's at the heart of this entire legal battle, the Uinta Basin Railway. So, the project is called the Uinta Basin Railway. It's an 88-mile line in Utah built for one main reason: to connect the super oil-rich Uinta Basin to the national rail network. This would let them ship crude oil way more efficiently down to refineries on the Gulf Coast. The federal agency in charge, the Surface Transportation Board, we'll just call them the STB, they gave it the green light. But that approval? It immediately ran smack into a major roadblock, a really powerful environmental law known as NEPA. And this, right here, is where the real fight kicks off. So what is NEPA? Well, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, passed way back in 1970. The gist of it is this: it forces federal agencies to study the potential environmental effects of a big project and then write up a super detailed report called an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, before they can give it a thumbs up. And you know, the Supreme Court has a very specific take on this law. Justice Kavanaugh, who wrote the majority opinion here, put it perfectly. He said NEPA is a procedural cross-check, not a substantive roadblock. What that means is, its job is to make sure a process is followed, that a report gets made, not to actually give an agency the power to kill a project just because of environmental concerns. And that process seems pretty simple on paper, right? The agency drafts a report, then the public gets to chime in, and boy did they. They got over 1,900 comments on this railway. And then, finally, the agency puts out its final official report. But here's the twist. For this project, that final report, the very thing that was supposed to wrap up the whole process, actually became the source of the whole problem. Which brings us to the core legal question that sent this thing rocketing up to the Supreme Court. And that final report was, well, it was a monster. Just get a load of this number. Over 3,600 pages. That's the final environmental report for this 188-mile railway. So you're probably thinking, a 3,600-page report, what could possibly be the problem? Well, the fight wasn't about what was in the report, it was about what opponents claimed was missing. It all boiled down to one critical question: where does an environmental review stop? Where do you draw the line? This really lays out the two sides of the argument perfectly. So on the left, you've got the lower court's view. They said the agency had to analyze all reasonably foreseeable effects. For them, that meant looking upstream at the impact of drilling more oil because of the railway, and downstream at the impact of refining all that oil on the Gulf Coast. But the agency's argument on the right was that NEPA only told them to study the proposed action, meaning the railroad itself. The drilling and the refining, they argued, were totally separate projects for other agencies to worry about. So this fundamental disagreement, just how far does an environmental review have to go, that is exactly what landed on the Supreme Court's doorstep. Okay, let's get to the verdict. And the outcome was a total, decisive victory for the railroad supporters. The Supreme Court completely overturned the lower court's decision. They basically gave a full-throated endorsement to the agency that approved the project in the first place. That 3,600-page report, in their eyes, it was more than enough. So why'd they rule this way? Well, the majority's opinion really stood on two key pillars. First, something called judicial deference. This is just the idea that judges shouldn't be acting like project managers, micromanaging these reports. They should give agencies a lot of leeway. And second, and this is the big one, is limited scope. They confirm that NEPA is about the proposed action. In this case, the railroad, not these other upstream or downstream things that the railroad agency has absolutely zero authority to control. The court used some pretty vivid language to make this point. They warned that NEPA, which started out as a simple legislative acorn, had been turned by the courts into this massive judicial oak that has hindered infrastructure development. I mean, that's a really clear signal that they felt the courts had just gone way too far in interpreting the law. Now, it's worth pointing out that even the justices who agreed on the final vote had slightly different reasons for getting there. The majority took this really broad approach, focusing on deference and the limited scope of NEPA for pretty much all agencies. But the justices who wrote the concurring opinion, they took a much narrower path. Their whole argument was specific to this agency, the STB, saying its own rules just don't give it the power to deny a railroad based on what that railroad happens to be carrying. Okay, so the Uinta Basin Railway gets its green light. But this case was never just about one single railroad. So what does this decision mean for the rest of us, for the next big project in your state? This is where we get to the real-world impact. Basically, this ruling is a major course correction. It sets new rules of the road for any project that needs a federal environmental review. It's sending a super clear message to agencies and courts about where that line should be drawn. And the potential consequences here are huge. This decision could streamline approvals for all kinds of major infrastructure. We're talking highways, bridges, pipelines, you name it. But here's the interesting twist. This doesn't just apply to fossil fuel projects. The exact same legal logic could actually speed up the review process for renewable energy projects like wind and solar farms, which have also been notoriously stuck in NEPA challenges for years. And you know, this ruling doesn't exist in a vacuum. It really fits with a bigger trend. On the left here, you see the 3,600-page report for our railway. Now, compare that to the new legal limit that Congress just set in the Builder Act. It caps most of these reports at just 150 pages. The Supreme Court's thinking here is running on the exact same track as Congress's clear desire to speed these things up. So what's the ultimate legacy of this decision? Is it a common-sense victory that clears a path for building the stuff America needs? Or does it weaken a crucial shield for the environment by narrowing the way we look at these projects? This Supreme Court ruling, it didn't end that debate. It just raised the stakes and guaranteed that the fight over how we build our future is only just beginning.